So we're going to cover buffs today, but before we start that, I just thought I should maybe sort of point out the current state of the game. I took the systems that we've already been implemented and expanded some of them out enough so that the game could start having sort of minor playtest sessions. So that meant I had to correct the house interior. So this crazy thing that looks all weird from the outside, that's actually the new house interior model. You can see there's like passageways and spiral staircase. You can swim up here, up into the top of the house. So I just made it a more interesting space for players to grow coral and stuff in. And then when they go out the door of that one into their backyard, they'll be in this space here. So this is like a farmyard for them, and this is what I am showing them that their outside of their house looks like. So notice that this thing bears no resemblance to this thing. That's one of the advantages of a system like this where you're just rezzing the space the player's in. That means when you're working on an outside of the house, you only have to worry about the outside, and when you're working on the inside, you only have to worry about the inside. It's very helpful when you're doing kit bash. Makes life a lot easier. So we go back over to the main Coral Town scene and just sort of ignore the fog of the water. I'm definitely going to keep messing with that. I'm really not sure what I want it to look like. That error is still there, but don't worry about that one. That's still that same reactive component one. It'll get fixed soon. I moved the coral that was in town around just a little bit so that it looks, just less bad. It's not just a line. Again, just to make things ready for playtesters. I also made it so if nobody's logged into the lot, the little houses show a window instead of showing a door. I can actually show how I'm doing that. So if you'll remember, player lots have object loaders, and that's how we're showing the art. But there's settings on these object loaders. This one here, house entrance art, is set to requires owner to load. That's the door. The door will only show up if there's a player. This one is set to requires no owner to load, and that one's set to load up the window. That's how I'm controlling that, which thing should happen. And part of the reason I did this is I knocked the game down to 16 players because of some object limit things. The long and short of it is the pre-placed coral producers, just for the placeholder for them, take up quite a bit of object count when multiplied by 32. I need to be able to load them like the gatherable templates, and the framework can't do that yet. So I put it on the request list for the framework, and hopefully we'll be able to solve that. This will not affect your game unless you're abusing gatherables or producers like I am. If you're using gatherables for the wild areas, which would be the case for most games, you wouldn't have this problem. This is only because I'm using the producers, which were meant to be more like a farm plant, in the wild all over the place. So if we just keep playing, you'll notice I changed the art for my doorway too, so it looks a little bit nicer. So this is my new house. Same thing I just showed you that we could fly around. That's the area with the windows up there. And down here we have our weird little exit hallway thing. These will have labels to them eventually, but this one should lead out to the farm. Yeah, so here you can see I'm on my farm. This is my little house. And then this one leads out to the canyon. Takes a second, but here you can see the coral lotting in. And I haven't worked on this all weekend because I was making some other videos to help some people that were stuck. So now all my poor corals died. Again, it normally wouldn't. We just have quick death settings for testing purposes. But yeah, I changed, this portal to look a little better, and lots of changes like that. So the game just looks a little bit nicer, a little bit more coherent. Part of the reason for the whimsical design in here is that a lot of this is actually going to be filled with rubble, like a gatherable that you actually have to dig out. And I don't want it to be super obvious to you which way you should need to dig necessarily. There's going to be quite a lot of content in this game, and I want you to sort of be exploring it slowly and discovering it, not just having everything right away when you start. So that's the state of the game. Let's go back over to the other scene. Okay, here we have the thing that I'm going to use to test buffs. The reason they have a sphere around them is that a buff will be emitted from an object that's set to emit a buff from essentially its pivot point. So that's where, when you select that object, that's where this little arrow would be. That's where the buff radiates out from, and it does so in a sphere. Because the coral game is more three-dimensional, than a lot of other games. I do actually need to know where the buff is touching in a circle around this thing, not just the ground circle that I would have used to test it in farming. In farming, it would have been enough just to use the circle on the ground here, and that would show you, say, if a crop was inside a sprinkler or not. But I need something a bit more complicated here. That's what we're going to set up. We're going to set up these 4 things to be a placeable object that gives off a buff. This white one here, we're just going to use as like a hologram when you're placing the buff statues out. So this is the one that we're going to set as a hologram because we don't want the big sphere in it, because the hologram replaces the whole asset with hologram material. And if we did that on a big sphere, it'd be hard to see what you were working with. So that's why I made a separate hologram model. And then these ones are the icons and the drop icons, just like setting up any other placeable. And then this last object I have, I'm calling it a buff detector, but what it really is going to be a set of little geometry that can be turned on and off with reactive components to tell me if my buffs are working, right? So I'll basically put this into my corals. We'll start with just one, maybe the purple tree coral. So I'll put this inside of it, and then we'll build all those buff statues and see if we can get those buffs affecting that purple coral. And this is how we'll tell. Instead of worrying about making the coral bleach or anything like that first we'll just make sure we have the buff system working and that the series of different buffs are feeding off each other the way that we intend. As to what these buffs are going to be, the yellow one is going to mean sunlight. In real life, coral actually needs sunlight to grow. Not all of it. There's some deep sea corals that have other food sources, but the little critters that live, like the algae that lives in coral, needs sunlight. So that's why we have a sunlight one. And then we have this one is going to be my high temperature buff. So if there's a heat vent or something in the environment, it'll have this high temperature one around it that will stop certain corals and creatures from wanting to grow, and it'll also could cause bleaching. This is a red tide buff. That's like an algae bloom, basically, and again, that could cause bleaching. And then this is my bleaching buff. So bleaching buff won't naturally occur. It'll have to be, the water will have to be warm, or an algae bloom or some other problem to trigger the bleaching. That's how that'll work. So that's the 4 that we're going to start with. The actual game will have more buffs than this, but this is already quite a bit to get working. What we're going to do right now is set up some reactive components, I think, and we'll set up the buff data tables. Let's start by opening the buff table. Okay, we only right now have these buffs that existed in the previous game. We'll delete both of these in a second, but I'm going to leave them there just so we can look at them while we're talking about what's going to go on here. So let's insert a row below. We're going to call these buffs bleaching, red tide, high temp, and sunlight. We'll just use the same thing as the name for now. Now let's take a look up at the 2 buffs up the top here. So this one here has a duration, this watered one. It'll run out at the end of this time. And that's probably not really what we're going to want, right? We don't want, it wouldn't make sense for these things to run out. Instead, at some point, the thing giving them off might go away, but it's probably not going to be on a duration timer. The permanent checkbox, though, that's down on fertilized here, that makes the buff just stay, and it has no time or anything on it, and it just stays there until something removes it. That's why it's on the fertilized section, because you apply the fertilizer to the crop, and then the crop will stay fertilized until you harvest it. That's kind of the 2 situations we have going here. That's what they are. This last one, max stacks, this can't be at 0. It has to be at least 1. You can use this for various things, but we don't, right now we just need it at 1 so that the buff can work. So let's get rid of these first 2 that we just left as examples. So we just have the ones we added. Now the other thing, I'm sure you've noticed here, is that we do need a unique storage ID for buffs. So let's do that. Just give each of them their own number, and that should be good to go. So that's all it takes. The buffs now exist in the game. However, to use a buff, we have to have something giving off the buff, and that's done in one table, and then something else receiving the buff, and that will be done in the table of whatever's receiving it. So we need to set those up. I think the producer buffs table is the one we're going to want next. This set was kind of set to match up with the buffs that we just removed. You can see the fertilizer was being taken in as this fertilized carrot, and the water was being used by the soil here. We're obviously not going to use these anymore, but again, we can take a look at their settings before we make our own. So the water one, because it had a duration and it would drain during all these circumstances, while building, while ready, while whatever. We're not really using a buff that's got that kind of functionality that right now. Now these ones are interesting though, right? This remove on producer remove, that's the one that you use for like the fertilized carrots and stuff, where when you pick the producer, the buff's going to go with it. The watered one is required to start building because you have to water your plant for it to grow, required while building, and required while rebuilding. So we're not going to need rebuilding because we are not putting in anything that rebuilds right now. But these first two might sound kind of useful to us, right? Because we want sunlight to be required to start building and required while building. We're not going to use, this is to use a tool to put the buff on, but we're not doing that. Our buffs are environmental in nature, so we're not really going to need those. I'm very sorry that the names of the columns here are cut off. It's sort of unfortunate. Hover over them to read the whole thing, because if you read the whole name, the names are meaningful. This one is required to allow expiring. So that's the one we're going to need for our coral to die when it's bleached. The coral would have to be bleached to be allowed to expire. It won't expire if it's just healthy. And then here you can see needing stuff to grow. There's a tools consumed option, so it'll use it. Uh-oh, I just saw there's probably a bug in all these things. It should all take one fertilizer, and it's all set to 0. That's very funny. I'll write that on the bug list for farming. Min allowed buff consumption is so that's to stop people from being able to accidentally waste all their buffs. If you can put a fertilizer on and then put it on again right away and right away and right away, you'd use up all your fertilizers by accident and the player would be frustrated. So that's not what we want. So instead we have some number here that's required before the player's allowed to reapply that buff. Since these are just all set to 0.5 on the fertilizer, and the fertilizer can't actually go down in value because it stays until it's removed, then the player can never add the fertilizer twice. Here's our drop modifiers because we can change our drops when a buff happens. This is like if something can then give off a buff, then the rules for that. In a buff table, let me open it up so you can see, there's this first part, the name and the ID. And this is on producer buffs, but there's going to be a similar one for placeable buffs and crafting buffs. They all have a table with very similar values, just slightly different depending on the functionality. This can receive checkbox is one option, but the other option is over here, can output. So if I wanted, I could make it so that when you watered the soil, then it would actually output the watered buff and water the soil near it. I could do both. But in a lot of cases, you only do one or the other. You either output or input, unless you need both functions for some reason. So now that we've sort of talked a bit about what's here, I'm going to stop talking just while I set up, and then I'll explain what I've done, but I just don't want to confuse myself by talking while I make these. I've done some work on this table here, but I have not set up the drop modifiers that I'm going to need. We'll delete these 2 rows. We don't need those anymore. Those are referring to the old game. These are my buffs, and this is the producer buffs table, so this means buffs that a coral can take in. Eventually, red tide and high temperature probably won't actually directly affect coral, but for now I'm going to leave them there just for testing, and I can remove them from this table later. I'm going to leave this here, but one thing that we're going to need is just for testing to make sure that our buff's working. I might make our corals drop an additional item. We won't worry about that yet. For now, we'll just save this and leave that alone. The next table that we need is the producers table, because we got to hook up these producer buffs that we just made. So let's go to producer there. So that's the producers for our game. And right now we only need to really do the purple coral because that's the only one I'm going to set up right now. Tame tree coral purple. You'll notice if you scroll all the way to the far end, there's a section called Producer Buff Ids. That's what connects it to one of these effects. So we're actually just going to put all 4 of these on there. So that means that that coral will be able to listen for all 4 of these buffs. Now the producers, so that's the purple coral, knows that these buffs exist, and these buffs are here, right? So they can go into the coral, and those are reading from the buffs table, but there's nothing actually giving off this buff. There's no way for the coral to get this buff on it. There's nothing in the environment that could give it off. So that's the part we need to remedy next. Just like the producer buff table, this one is going to have a can receive and a can output. The example that we have here is a sprinkler, and it's giving off the watered ID, and it can't receive it, it can only output it. And that's actually what we're interested in doing here as well, right? We want to put out these buffs from this one. We'll actually just overwrite the sprinkler here and make it do what we want instead. So we're going to name it the same kind of way, but instead of in, we're going to say out. The buff is called bleaching, and it's going to output it, but then we need it to be a radius. Now, a radius is like, half the diameter of a circle, and we want it to be the same as these lines. Okay, so every time this confuses me a little, but the radius, I believe, is in centimeters, and this object started as a 1 meter cube, but we only want half this because we want a radius, not a diameter. So that means that our number in theory should be 10 times 100. So it should be 1,000. We'll try it. We'll see if it's right. So that should make that sphere volume around that object the correct size. But now we need 3 more of these. And I'll just rename them to be the other 3 buffs. Much like we did for the producer buffs, where after we did our in buff, we had to put the ID into the producer table so that the purple coral could read it. We now need to attach these placeable buffs to the objects that we want in our placeable table. Again, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit for a minute here because I'm just going to add 4 items to this table, right? I need to add 4 new placeables, the ones that we just made, those 4 statues. And I will also have to add them over to the items table, same as anything else that can be put in your inventory. So I accidentally paused my recording there for a minute, but I've made the placeables data. I've made sure they had a unique storage ID. I've put in IDs and names for them. We have their static artwork. I also went and added Farm1 placeables as a valid replicator to this because I now have a new place that the players can decorate. So I just added that. I made it so you can put them down with a hand, lift them with a hammer, did some effects. You can use them on any of these surfaces, on the pavement, floor, sand. But the most important one is over here. This is the same thing we did before with the producer buffs and producers, but this time we did the placeable buffs and the placeables. So this is the placeable buff IDs, and I made sure that those matched these. That's what will make the connection so that these things can give off those buffs. The rest of this we don't need because it's for producer bases, for crafting tables, and for inventories, and these statues are just a decoration. They're none of those things. So that's all we need to do in this table, but now I need to make the item entries for them. We don't need super detailed information on the items here because they're just test items. They're not actually going to be things a player can acquire. They're just testing items for me. Okay, now that we have that stuff set up, the next thing we're going to need to do is some template changes, because I can put this stuff out in the world. Look, actually, let's go try that right now. Let's just go see if our item is in and working. I'll just move this to the other monitor for a sec. So something that I, of course, forgot to do was to put it in the starting items. So let's do that. The hologram at least is working, but let's go outside to test it because that seems a little big to be using in the house. We have these things, and it's putting out the correct item in the world, which is all good. We don't really have any way of knowing if they're giving off the buff, right? There's nothing here to indicate whether a buff is happening or not. That means we need to put a reactive component or something that's going to visually die when a buff is affected or something like that, right? We need to add something to our world that allows us to know if there's a buff that's working. So let's just swim above these and you can see all of those in theory have different effects happening inside them. But to actually know that, let's go set up our buff detector. So as I mentioned before, I made this little item. What we're going to do is put the scripts that react inside that item as a template, and then put that template into all the purple coral so that no matter what state it's in, we can tell which buffs it's receiving. If it's receiving the buff, then that means that we can then work on making it die or bleach or do whatever we want according to the buff. But the first thing with testing buffs, before you worry about that kind of thing, is just like, is it getting a buff? So that's what we're trying to determine right now. All right, so one thing to call out with reactive components is they will not work if you put them inside of these static, they can't be in static templates. And we're not going to need them in a drop or an icon. This should be the actual coral. We have state 1, 2, there should also be the seed one. Okay, so all of these need the buff detector in them. Nested templates certainly make tricky things like this much easier to do. That's a really great feature that came to Core, because before you weren't allowed to do this. So we're just going to lift all of these up a little bit so that we can see them. I could put one in the dead state, but it's fine. I don't really think I need to. Now I just need to update all of these. We'll of course remove these again. These detectors won't stay in here. So I put this object in here, but this object doesn't actually do anything. It's just a bunch of cubes. So we need to put some reactive scripts in here so that it can do something when it detects a buff. I'm renaming each of these little cubes just to make the next step easier for me to do. I'm really bad at remembering what I've called things. That's supposed to be sunlight, not sunshine. Seemed wrong. Okay, we're going to want to change color one. Change color with active buff. So that's what we're going to want. We're going to need we'll only need 4 copies of that one. So we'll need 1. And then for these two, we want to change their visibility probably. So that had me completely confused. Okay, so this one here is when the buff is on. This one here is when the buff is off. And this top one is targeting the healthy coral. This one will hide it when the bleaching is active. And then this one should show the bleached coral when the bleaching is active, if I've done any of that right. All right, so then this other one is a little more straightforward. I don't know if I really explained this part. You grab the object or the group that you want to be affected, and you put it into this object color slot. That's called a reference, and that lets the script know what it's talking to. So each of these has a different object reference there. For this one, the inactive color on all of them is going to be black, but their active colors are going to be different. So the active color on this one is just white. The active color on this one will be red. If you don't know what I'm doing here, I'm actually like if you select an object and then you scroll down to its material or to its color, you can copy that and paste it elsewhere. See, I copied that orange color, and now I'm going into the script and I'm pasting it into there. You can use this menu too if you want to just drag colors up here, but copying and pasting them works out fine when I only need it once. And then for the sunlight one, I need the color of yellow. Okay, so it should look something like this. Each of those has its own thing. Now the other part that each of these scripts needs to know is what buff it's waiting to hear. So put your buff IDs in. So in theory, that should be right. It's fine if we've made a mistake. That's the whole reason that we did this object as a template and then put it in all of here, because if we had to go into each of these and mess around with those scripts because we'd made a mistake, that would be very time consuming. So by putting, see, now I opened the buff detector inside that wild tree and you can see all the scripts in there. So by putting it inside of another template, we're saving ourselves work. So the next thing that we need to do is go back over to our other scene and test if this works. So to test this one, we're going to need purple coral and the ground net, because that's the one that the purple coral needs to be planted in. Okay, so my detector is showing up, and look at that, the red dot is lit. Ooh! It seems to be working. Okay, let's plant the next one. We put it in there, and let's just take a look at what's happening here. That is the bleached model that's showing. I think it accidentally has pink on it. Oh, it does. I gotta fix that. That's why it still looks so pinkish. But you can see this is the actual pink one, and this is the bleached version. It has bigger dots in its failure. It's just accidentally got a pink tint on it still, so I'll fix that. Okay, let's check the next buff. Now that buff, you may have noticed, is a little different than those other two. Look at that. The coral there and there are still just lying there. They haven't grown at all, but this one's gotten big. That's because I set this buff up with that checkbox that said that sunlight was required for it to grow. And we'll put this one in. We'll put a coral in, and there's the orange. So if I put a coral in this spot right here in between these two, it should grow, but it should also have the orange dot above it showing that it's in the orange, the high temperature buff zone. So let's just check that. There you go. It's in the yellow and the orange zone, and it's growing because yellow lets coral grow. So yeah, this seems like it's working. Our buff detector has showed us that all 4 of our buffs work in the scene, and that buff at least is working. The coral planted here, this seedling, should actually die. But it'll take a couple hours, I think, because I think that's what I have the time set for in the data. So let's just make a quick tweak and make coral die in like 10 seconds or something if it's in the bleach zone. We'll just see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll figure it out next video. The other quick change that I kind of want to make is to, we'll fix the tint on that bleach on the buff detector. Red sometimes means that you have a missing references or something, but if you've brought in your template and you haven't done anything in the scene that like instance template or de-instance, sometimes it'll all turn red, and that's just sort of a bug. So just de-instance it, and if it stays red, then fix it. But otherwise, it's fine. It's just like a visual issue. Just reset that, and then. So if I shut off the, oh, you can't see it because I forced it off. This is what you do to toggle something. This is what that script is changing. The toggle visibility is changing this setting to on or off. And look, we came back and our poor bleached coral has died. So that's good. That means that the 2 sort of buffs that we care about, the ones that our coral's actually going to have, the bleached buff and the sunlight buff, they both work. These other 2 buffs, those are going to be given off to trigger bleaching or other issues. That's great. This is all good. In the next video, we'll go on to keep refining the system to make it sort of more interesting. Although we might do an easier video first and play a little bit with the interaction system, but we'll see. All right, have fun, and I'll see you in the next video.